Hi everyone, we're going to look at Chapter 8, which is about the news. We're going to look at the outlining concept of what news is, the role of journalists, and the variables that determine what's reported. We're also going to look at how news has changed with the internet and 24/7 sources of the news and all the aggregation sites with this. It's kind of a news mill these days, so we're going to look at how that transition has happened and how it changes the information that we get. So let's start by looking at the concept of news. What constitutes newsworthiness of a story. The concept of news is basically to report changes that are occurring. So what gets reported on is really diverse. The news is a report of changes that are filtered through what is newsworthy. And newsworthiness changes on a daily basis. So what would be a front page headline story can often get pushed out of the limelight by an even bigger story if there's a lot of news in a day. And the components that make something newsworthy are proximity to the audience, or how close it is to the audience. It's more interesting to me if there's a train wreck in Rapid City than if there's a train wreck in New Zealand. Prominence of the people involved also makes things newsworthy. Like, it's more interesting if the president has lunch at McDonald's than if I have lunch at McDonald's. So a story could be written about that, but probably not about me. Timeliness makes things newsworthy, and this just includes that it's current. A train wreck that happened today is more newsworthy than a train wreck that happened 2 months ago. And then also the idea of the impact on society. How does it affect society as a whole, or the consequence of that story? So if I give $500 to the boys club, it's not as newsworthy as somebody giving them $5,000. So there's an impact or a consequence, or how it affects us as people. There's also this idea of like a gee whiz factor, like that's pretty novel or it's rare. So rarity plays into what news is. So the headlines are also shaped by gatekeepers, including journalists and editors, and their values and what they bring to the news. So news is change, and newsworthiness involves proximity, prominence, timeliness, consequence, and rarity. And the information that we get is through a filter of people who work in the news media. So let's look at the role of the journalist. Objectivity is a key quality for journalists to have, but nothing printed is ever value-free. Everything is infused with beliefs and biases of the reporter and the venue that's reporting. And every time a reporter makes a choice, there's some type of value system involved there, a personal value system. So how do we attempt to have objective news, which is really valued as an ethical rule in American journalism? Well, the penny press tried to make news more objective by removing opinions. Things stopped being reported in first person. There was no I or me associated with language, and facts really carried the stories. Then in 1848, the joint venture called the Associated Press started collecting nonpartisan articles and disseminating them to the news outlets. In order to save money, they combined offices in this way, and a lot of different newspapers used the Associated Press still to this day. And the AP is known for overly fact-driven content that is really devoid of partisanship. Another factor that really led newspapers into this idea of objectivity was economics. Super publishers found that they could reach a much larger audience if they stayed in the middle instead of leaning too far to one side. And profit-minded companies became more fact-driven publications because they sold more of their publication. And most reporters will agree on what newsworthy events are, like storms, new laws, things that change. But each perspective will always add a layer of personal values and dictate what is taken from an experience that the reporter has. And what values they subscribe to are always going to slant ideas. Because being human colors our perspective. And in America, we see things through an ethnocentric lens. So when reporting on a war, we might call the opposition the enemy, and in the opposition's news, they're going to give us that title. U.S. journalists favor democracy and capitalism. We write about problems in big cities and we glorify small towns while we kind of ignore the suburbs. U.S. journalists are really biased towards supporting moderation instead of extreme views on anything. And U.S. journalists cover social disorder like storms, laws, and family life, but they don't focus on the problem and all the gore and horrible things that are happening in the story so much as how to restore order. So there's this real idea that we need to fix problems and restore social order and stay in the middle. So what happens a lot with deadline-driven stories and this idea of restoring order and staying in the middle is that a lot of our information comes from officials or the man. So if there's an accident or a court case, the newspaper or the media might go to a police officer or a judge or somebody on the enforcement side of the law to collect information. And so a lot of our media comes from the viewpoint of the establishment. And so those are things that we need to understand when we look at the idea of objectivity in our news and values, and just the personal values of the person reporting is going to create a bias no matter what. So objectivity is kind of this elusive thing that we can go after. It creates really boring news when you're completely objective because you can only report the facts and that's it. So it gets colored in different ways through the different lenses that it's seen through. Most media outlets subscribe standard to their reporting. They view themselves as truth seekers. They're watchdogs for the people who report important changes. And then this banner of being a watchdog allows them to stay credible with the press, and it helps them define their place and their value in the world. So professional standards include looking out for the people and informing the people about changes in the world and society and community around them. Let's look at some of the variables that affect the news that we get, especially in newspapers. News holes. This is just the space that's left over after all the ads have been inserted into the paper or wherever we're receiving our news from. It's after all the money has been made and the space is left over or where our information goes. The news flow. This is the flow of newsworthy events that come in, and these fluctuate each day. So what we hear about in a given day, the importance of those stories would change on any other day, because if there's many stories coming in, one of them has to kind of climb to the top and be considered more important than the others. Staffing, and that's just the available resources by a media outlet and what they're able to cover in the news. So the news's job is to make sure that reporters are in the right place at the right time. And with a lot of the revenue that's being lost in the newspaper industry as we transition to digital, there's been a lot of cuts in reporting staff, which has made the coverage less comprehensive. And then there's the idea of competition, and this affects the news because it leads to a pack or herd journalism of a news source. They all vie for the best coverage of an event, and they make decisions on the fly about what should get covered and what lead to follow. And many variables come into play when sources are trying to get the best scoop. If there's a big event like the presidential debates that were recently on, you'll notice that every news source pretty much was following that event because the election is close, it's timely, and the people debating are prominent. And so there's this whole herd or pack of journalists trying to get the best scoop and the best story and the best quote and talk about the most popular idea at the same time, when there's actually other news happening at the same time that's not getting covered, so it gets knocked out of the way and not reported on. With the influx of cyber news, there's been an even bigger divergence from traditional news reporting. And while some sources stick to objective standards and truth-based reporting, the internet's easy, low-cost access has spawned many news sources like blogs or even Facebook that speak from extremely slanted points of view and report unsubstantiated news presented as facts. So we have to be very careful about the news that we take in online because it's full of people who don't have any journalistic values, who are reporting from a very narrow mindset. It's just difficult to kind of wade through all the information and all the citizen journalists online and really find the facts. Then we have like aggregation sites like the Huffington Post that have popped up and the Drudge Report. And these sites, they just collect stories from all the other news sites and then they report them. And they also collect links to sites and they just kind of work as a news portal. So you can go there and find information about a lot of different articles that are popping up in a lot of different news sources. And then distributive journalism. This is often the label that's given to online news sources, and it's just the collection of news from widely different sources, and it's not really checked for accuracy before it's re-reported. And although it didn't begin with the internet, the quality of news can be affected by unsubstantiated claims, including hoaxes. Like a couple of years ago we had the Bigfoot hoax, and then Bubble Boy, that the little boy was in the big balloon floating above Denver or wherever that was. The internet has really fostered disinformation through a super rapid dissemination and self-proclaimed journalists who are unaware or ignore these standards of journalism. Quality and accuracy are some of the things that can be affected by everybody reporting what they want all the time, because there's no gatekeepers on the internet. In traditional forms of media, gatekeeping was done through editors and other media people who make decisions, and it was one of the ways that the quality of news was maintained. And websites are often ran by one person or very few people, and they can go unchecked. So taking away that gatekeeper position is both positive and negative, because now there's not a few people who decide what information we get, but there's also nobody there to check everything that's put out. So there's a pro and a con side to that gatekeeper position. So in our new age of journalism, we've seen a lot of transitions. Although media being democratized the way that it has can be very positive, it also comes with some drawbacks. The news has become less comprehensive. The news goes 24/7 and competition can be fierce, so not very much energy is expended on most stories. The story is reported and dropped and then on to the next scoop. You have to just keep moving to try to keep up with the pace of information. The news is less enterprising. They have smaller staffs that do more work. They opt for quick and easy stories that don't require digging or time to report on, so they just kind of get the surface and then they move on. There are fewer beats or specialized coverage because of less staff. Journalists have to cover a broader, more generalized section of the news, and this leads to reporting that's less specialized and knowledgeable about topics reported on. The reporter is not always an expert on what they report. There's also less independent reporting. The papers pack in content from the Associated Press and other sources that cost less to generate content, and as a result, less independent local coverage makes the news. Now the news is nonstop, which lends itself to event-based reporting, where reporters feel pressured to find new angles to interest the audience, and this pressure leads to elevating trivial events within an event in order to get the scoop. This trivial information often kind of comes in and clouds the context and the audience understanding of an event. And then we also have unedited blogs, which can be irresponsible, believable. They can wag the media through their reports, and there's no gatekeeper for these sources and no way to truly substantiate their claims. So I will see you guys in class. Have a great day.